Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, you guys really love the top 10 lists, the variety videos, the ones that kind of cover a lot of history with a particular focus in mind. In this case, we're talking about the 10 worst years in human history. Now, that's a pretty high bar when you're talking about thousands of years of recorded history to try and narrow it down to 10 years that we think are the worst. Obviously, this is all subjective. It's all people's opinion. What constitutes the worst? Is it death? Is it war? Is it famine, disease? Is it economic crisis? There'll probably, no doubt, be a very heavy recency bias in this, or just focus on things we know more about. So there are certain years that might have been awful, but they were so awful that nobody wrote anything down about them. We just don't know about it. So we can only go off the information we have. This is from the channel TopTenz. I'll put the link in the description, as always, so you can check it out without my commentary and see all of their other videos as well. I've done quite a few of theirs, so I'll throw up some links at the end to some of the other TopTenz videos that I've done in the past. I want to give a thank you to Randy Wilson, who is our latest executive producer level patron. He's from Sterling, Virginia. Randy, I'm going to get your name up on the end screen real soon. I only update that every couple of weeks, so I'll get that on there soon. Thank you so much for your support. Could not do this without you. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Picking the worst years throughout human history is no easy task, as most of it has been undocumented and full of spectacularly bad years. We've come a long way from our famine and almost constantly war-ravaged early past, having somehow managed to build a working civilization despite everything nature has thrown at us over the ages. However, for the years that we do have the records for, it's not that difficult to pick out the lowest
So that one's, I'm guessing that's the London Fire, 1666.
times for our civilization, times when everything seemed to be worse than it ever was, with no hope in sight, either due to natural calamities like global pandemics or man-made reasons like financial crises or war. These worst years in recorded history remind us of the fragility of human progress and development, as well as serve as a testament to our ability as a species to, in a manner of speaking, still make something of ourselves despite growing up in a really bad neighborhood. Number 10, 1315. The year 1315 may have flown under the radar of most historians, counting down the worst times in human history, as it was hardly a global phenomenon, except...
And my plan is with each of these, as I do typically when they're top 10 lists and things like that, I'll try to let it go all the way to the end unless there's a compelling reason to stop in the middle.
For those people who were living in Europe. It was the beginning of perhaps the worst famine in European history in terms of the ratio of population affected, triggered by torrential, almost biblical rains and floods across the continent that severely affected food production and transport. It was made worse by the recent explosion in population across the continent, as the production levels were already falling way behind what was needed to sustain the number of people that solely depended on farming to survive. While it was an issue in most parts of Europe, the famine's worst effects were felt by what's now the UK, France, and Germany. While estimates vary, records suggest that anywhere from 10 to 25% of the continent's population was reduced directly because of the famine. The famine also brought isolated yet devastating outbreaks of diseases to rural regions, as around 10 to 15% of the population succumbed to diseases such as pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis caused by malnutrition and weakness. While it was nothing compared to the destruction caused by the Black Death barely 30 years later, which we'll obviously talk about in just a bit, it was still one of the worst population collapses in European history, making the 1400s an especially crappy century for their inhabitants.
I was going to say, I think you could make a strong argument for the 14th century, in other words, the 1300s, being one of the worst centuries in history, between that famine and the plague that would hit later and kill possibly half of Europe's population. Certainly an argument can be made there. And obviously, this is probably going to be a very Eurocentric and Western-centric video when it comes to the events that are being talked about. This is an English-speaking channel made by people who are English-speaking, whose most familiar areas of history are going to deal with Europe and the Americas. So, like my channel, which focuses much heavier on Western history than it does on, say, East Asia, that's just the reality, is that that's who the audience is. So I don't know if I could pick any one single year in the 14th century as being the worst, but certainly that century, I would say the 20th century and the 14th century, have to be candidates for the discussion when it comes to the worst centuries in history.
9. 1816. The year 1816, which we've since come to know as the year without summer, may not be much compared to the who's who of bad times that is the rest of this video, but it was still bad enough to deserve a spot here. While some research points to the eruption of Mount Tempora in 1815, the largest volcanic eruption on the planet for the last 10,000 years, as the primary cause, records show that the weather had already started to cool off by the beginning of 1815. While we may never know exactly what caused it, we know that the global average temperature dipped by about 2 degrees. It led to many isolated yet related events across North America and Europe. In New England, the crop failure caused by the cooling resulted in a bulk of farmers moving west, permanently reshaping the demographic of the country. In Europe, the abnormally cold summer led to a widespread failure of the potato crop, resulting in famine and one of the worst typhus outbreaks in history. There were sporadic incidences of rebellions and food riots in other European countries too, though thankfully it didn't last for a long time. The dark and gloomy vibe of the year has since been immortalized in quite a few literary works. The setting of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, as an example, was directly inspired by the dark and gloomy skies that she witnessed during her vacation to Switzerland at the time. Number 8.
I don't think I'd put that in my 10 worst years in history. It's an interesting year to talk about, and it's coming right on the heels of the end of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, which killed millions of people. It's right after the War of 1812 in North America. You have this major, like one of the strongest earthquakes to ever hit what is now the mainland of the United States. New Madrid, Missouri takes place around this time. So there are events happening. I don't think any of them constitute the worst. And I'm hoping that they're going to include some of the major events that have happened in places like China, where you have these civil wars that are some of the deadliest wars in human history. Those are events that certainly need to be talked about as well. And I'll throw out some of my own ideas for ones that they don't mention once we get to the end.
1600. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact causes behind why the year 1600 was the beginning of one of the worst times in human history, as we have few historical records from that time to say for sure. It was the Little Ice Age, likely beginning with the eruption of a volcano in Peru in 1600, though recent research points to the massive reduction in population following the arrival of Europeans in the New World as another potential cause. It resulted in abnormally cold weather in many regions around the world, including China, Korea, Japan, and almost the entirety of Europe, as well as parts of Africa and the Americas. Unlike many other periods on this list, this one was spread out across almost the entire known world at the time and lasted for decades, causing widespread social upheaval and suffering.
So if it's something that lasts for decades, how do we really pinpoint it to 1 year? I don't know.
The global dip in temperatures would form the basis for all the tumultuous events of the 17th century around the world. It caused a dramatic dip in summer temperatures in China, resulting in widespread crop failure and epidemics across the country. That would eventually lead to the fall of the Ming Dynasty in 1644 due to a peasant rebellion fueled in large part by widespread scarcity of food and social unrest. The same happened in other parts of Asia. Korea, for instance, lost 20% of its population due to a drought in 1670. In Europe, there were frosts during the summer months spread out over almost the entire century, resulting in rebellions, infectious disease outbreaks, and famine, which eventually translated into war and social upheaval not seen in the relatively prosperous years of the past few centuries. In Ireland, civil war and famine resulted in over 500,000 casualties over the course of almost a decade in the 1650s, according to some records. This was also the century of the 30 Years' War across Europe, perhaps one of the most brutal religious conflicts in human history, which was directly fueled by the hardships of the famine and abnormal temperatures of the Ice Age. While there are too many long-term effects of this one to count here, all in all, estimates suggest that the diseases, wars, famines, and civil wars caused by this global cooling event resulted in the deaths of around 1/3 of the known global population at the time. Number 7.
All right, you got a strong argument there. If it was caused by an earthquake, not an earthquake, a volcanic eruption, which is interesting how often these volcanic eruptions can spew so much ash into the atmosphere that it can affect the entire global climate for decades afterwards. Massive stuff like that. I mean, it's fascinating how changes in ocean temperature and changes in air temperature can of even a couple of degrees can have such a major impact on the world and on its history. So if that is the year that that event happened, and if that's the event that triggered all of that other stuff, then yeah, absolutely. And if that's the case, then I think we have a strong argument to be made that 1914 is going to need to be on this list, because the events that happened in 1914 really triggered not only the 4-year First World War, but because of the First World War, we get the flu pandemic, which might not have otherwise spread as rapidly as it did, which leads to, and basically World War I then leads to everything that happens in the 20th century. So we'll see what happens.
536. Choosing the worst year in history, despite our best research, is a subjective effort. Many years on this list have been merely one year in a long series of bad times, or even decades in some cases. According to one Harvard historian specializing in medieval history named Michael McCormick, though, we have a singular definitive answer to the question, what was the worst year in human history?
In fact, this is 536. I think there are YouTube videos with the title Worst Year in Human History talking about 536.
And that would be 536. It was the beginning of a mysterious fog that plunged Europe, the Middle East, and large parts of Asia into a continuous 18-month fog, causing an almost permanent dimming of the sun throughout the entire period. Temperatures fell by up to 2.5 degrees Celsius, which was the beginning of the coldest decade in at least 2,300 years. The period was marked by summer frost and snow in places across China and other parts of Asia, causing abysmally low yields and diseases, as well as widespread famine in European regions like Ireland. If that wasn't enough, just a few years later, in 541, entire parts of Europe were hit by the plague of Justinian, a bubonic plague outbreak named after the Byzantine emperor at the time. One of the deadliest plagues in history, which was made worse by the ongoing Gothic War, the outbreak would end up claiming the lives of over 100 million people across the empire. While we may never know the precise causes behind this period of widespread plague, war, and famine, some recent research suggests that a massive volcano eruption in Iceland may have been one of the possible culprits. Whatever the reason, the year 536 would go down in human history as the beginning of one of the worst times for humanity, and it would be centuries before the worst-hit regions would be able to fully recover from it. Number 6.
So that's now 3 of these years that are triggered by volcanic eruptions. But when you lose significant chunks of your population, it has a snowball effect, because now you're not producing as much food, because you're losing farmers. You're not producing anything you need. You're losing doctors. You're losing scientists. You're losing military and political leaders. You're losing everything that makes society function. So just imagine if suddenly a third or a half of the people in your community are gone, how that has a destructive effect long term. All right, we're getting a 19 here for the first time. Is it going to be 1914, 1918, 1939?
1918. The Spanish flu of 1918 may not have been the worst pandemic in history, though combined with the First World War and the social and political upheaval of the years following it, it definitely was the beginning of one of the worst times to be alive in human history. While the exact numbers will probably never be fully quantified, the plague caused an estimated 50 to 100 million deaths around the world, which may far surpass the total death counts of both the world wars combined. It lasted for 15 months and hit almost every major country at the time in 3 waves, each one deadlier than the last. The worst part was how fast it spread. While the Black Death was spread out over the course of decades in many isolated waves around the world, the Spanish flu took all of 15 months to do everything it did. The pandemic came on the heels of one of the most destructive global wars in history too, making the effects more pronounced than they otherwise would have been. In the US alone, it killed around 675,000 people out of a population of 105 million, almost 10 times the number that died in the war, and reduced the average life expectancy by around 10 to 12 years. The year also marked the beginning of decades of unrest for a major part of the world, partially fueled by the devastation of the pandemic and partly fueled by the events in Russia, where a popular and brutal uprising had just successfully deposed the emperor. It inspired countless anti-imperialist and anti-colonial civil wars around the world, which would end up shaping the world for years to come. Number 5.
So I agree with the concept. I just disagree with the execution, I guess you could say. I would argue it's 1914. 1914, as I said earlier, is the year that triggers all of this. And I have to wonder if without the World War from 1914 to 1918, whether we even have a global pandemic with what we call the Spanish flu, because the earliest confirmed real outbreak of it is in North America. It's in Kansas, and American troops bring that to the Western Front, where it spreads among the Western Front, and then all of those troops, when the war is over, go home and they take it with them. Now, would it have spread eventually anyway? Maybe not as fast, maybe not that quickly or early, but I feel like then obviously it triggers the Russian Revolution. World War I does, and all of the other revolutions, which lead to some of the worst events that happen in history. The Armenian genocide, you have the genocide that happens in Ukraine because of starvation. We've got a lot of other events that unfold because of all of that. So I would say 1914, but I still agree with the general concept here. 1929, man, in all of world history, this is where I was talking about maybe some recency bias is going to creep into all of this.
1929. As far as market crashes go, the Wall Street crash of 1929 followed a similar pattern to all the other financial crashes that have happened before or since, fueled by excessive speculation on market assets that just didn't reflect the reality on the ground, especially in the United States, as well as an influx of cheap credit from financial institutions that allowed the bubble to grow ever larger until it collapsed. It was a textbook example of how global markets have a way of correcting themselves. What sets it apart from all the other crashes, though, is the scale of the wipeout and the magnitude of the consequences that followed. The recession that followed was, taking the size of the economy into account, the largest recession in history for the developed world. By some estimates, employment grew to over 20% in the US alone in the years following the crash, and the GDP fell by over 30% during its peak years, dwarfing the next biggest recession in history, that of 2007 to 2009, by a long shot. The Great Depression, as it has since come to be known in popular imagination, triggered many of the worst events of the 20th century, and we're not even talking about the direct effects like mass deprivation and years of hardships faced by people in almost every industrialized economy around the world. The recession, combined with rapidly depleting resources in recently industrialized economies like Germany and Japan, fueled the oncoming rise of extreme nationalistic and populist ideologies, paving the way for the widespread destruction and suffering of the Second World War, the largest global military conflict in history. Number 4.
So I guess I can understand the argument for 1929 if we are making a direct correlation to the events that lead to World War II. So from that standpoint, perhaps you're right, but I would still put all of that on 1914. Of course, then you could put all of that on the French Revolution and the American Revolution, because it's all connected. So I guess at what point do you pick a year? That's why this is all subjective, but it's interesting to talk about. Now, this one I absolutely 1,000% disagree with and argue this is recency bias. 2020 sucked for most of us who lived through it, but worst years in human history? Nah, not even close.
Or 2020. While it may be too early to call it yet, and it may still not match up to most of the other worst years in history in this video, the year 2020 was certainly one of the worst in living memory. As
Living
most of the
memory,
world spent its time locked inside.
Let's keep in mind that for living memory, that means the last century at most. There's thousands of years of human history to compare that to.
Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, in itself one of the worst pandemics in history, the year was marked by many lows not experienced by anyone alive today. The worst part, with a devastating resurgence of the virus in many countries around the world happening right now, the ordeal may be far from over. In terms of sheer numbers, it's rather easy to make the case for 2020 being one of the worst times in history. Up to right now, the outbreak has infected a little less than over 160 million people worldwide, and over 3.2 million have already died. While those may not seem like huge numbers considering the global population today, and particularly devastating pandemics in history like the Black Death and Spanish flu, consider that the numbers are still being counted. We're still reporting over 14,000 deaths every day, with particularly worrying statistics coming out of countries like Brazil and India. As for its economic impact, many experts, including the IMF, have already called the recession caused by the pandemic to be the worst since the Great Depression of the 1930s, and many countries are seeing a record dip in their GDPs, not seen since the 19th century. The impact.
So I think now in hindsight, we're a little further down the road from when this video was recorded. We can look back and say, all right, it was bad, it was really bad, and it certainly was awful for the families, including my own, who lost loved ones because of that pandemic. But still, worst in human history. I mean, I'm not even sure I would put 2020 in the worst 10 years of the last century.
Impact has been most acute in economies largely dependent on global trade and finance. Thankfully, though, with the vaccination drive in full swing in most parts of the world, that is expected to get better sooner rather than later. Number 3, 1943. While it'd be immensely inaccurate to pick the worst year of the Second World War, as no year from the largest, most devastating global war we've ever seen could be called better than any other, 1943 was, without a doubt, when some of the worst events of the war took place. For one, it was the peak of the Holocaust. By the end of spring of that year,
people forget that the kind of the real push for the Holocaust, like the events that unfold, a lot of people think that the Holocaust was already like in full swing in like the mid to late 1930s or even in the first years of World War II. But it's really like 1942 into 1943 when the real mass extermination of European Jews and other undesirables, Bolsheviks, as the Germans called them, Russians, gypsies, homosexuals, the disabled. 42, 43, and 44 are the years where that's really at its peak.
Genocide had already claimed the lives of around 1.3 million Jewish prisoners from across Nazi-held territory, though that number included quite a few Romers, partisans, and Soviet prisoners of war. It was also the year Joseph Mengele, the most infamous of all Nazi scientists responsible for some of the most inhumane experiments on the prisoners, was appointed to Auschwitz, beginning arguably the worst phase of the Holocaust yet. On the other side of the world, in India, another lesser-known but equally devastating event was taking place. The Bengal famine of 1943, caused by the British forces diverting massive amounts of food resources from the region to aid the war effort in the Eastern Theatre, caused the deaths of close to 3 million people in the state, making it one of the worst disasters of the entire war. The year was also the culmination and peak of the Battle of Stalingrad, easily the largest and bloodiest battle in human history in terms of sheer numbers, with over 2 million military and around 400,000 civilians dead by the end of it. While it was a turning point for the Allied forces, as they weren't really winning until this point, the human cost of this single battle was immense, both for Germany and the Soviet Empire.
Take the time to let the numbers sink in of a battle like Stalingrad. 2 million military, nearly 500,000 civilian deaths in one battle. Granted, our concept of a battle changes in the 20th century. You know, up until then, battles were 1, 2, 3 day events for the most part. Gettysburg, Waterloo, Austerlitz, Cannae. All of these battles in human history are single or 2 or 3 day events. You get into the 20th century and talking about something like the Battle of the Bulge, which is multiple weeks, Stalingrad, which is a better part of a year, Battle of Verdun is almost a year, Battle of the Somme is several months long. These are really more campaigns that have individual battles within them. So Stalingrad is not a battle the same way that Gettysburg's a battle, but it is fought in one geographic location between opposing armies. And so, you know, over the part of, a year and a half here, we're talking about millions of deaths. Just mind-boggling numbers.
Number 2, 1492. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas is often discussed as one of the most devastating events for the continent's population, and accurately so. However, most of us don't realize the sheer numbers we're talking about here, as most estimates are clearly exaggerated or understated, making all of them hard to believe. If we look at a recent study quantifying the extent of the tragedy, though, it's clear that the year 1492, when Columbus first landed somewhere in the Caribbean and paved the way for the colonization of the Americas, marked the beginning of one of the worst periods for humanity. Done by researchers at the University of London in 2019, the study for the first time collated all published records of the pre-Columbian population of the continents and found it to be close to 60 million. By the beginning of the 17th century, that number would be reduced by around 56 million, as the entire region was now devastated by decades of war, diseases they had no immunity to, like smallpox, the bubonic plague, and influenza, and reduction in arable area due to foreign invasion, as the majority of the population still relied on farming for sustenance. As a proportion of the global population, this was the single biggest reduction of human population in history, as it made up close to 10% of all people living in the world at the time. In comparison, the second most devastating event, the Second World War, which was in itself one of the biggest tragedies we've ever faced, reduced the global population by 3%. The impact of this absolute decimation of the Native American population was so huge that it even affected global weather patterns, as the number of people working on farms was reduced by such a massive extent, and all of that area was soon reclaimed by nature. Combined with the above-mentioned eruption of that volcano in Peru, it caused a dip in temperature around the world by the beginning of the 17th century, causing famines, disease outbreaks, and social unrest from Europe all the way to China and Japan. Number 1.
So, I'm again, we're kind of going back and forth between triggering event years and actual years that were devastating. 1943 is only devastating because of war that breaks out in the 1930s. 1492 itself is not a devastating year for the world, but it's a trigger event that leads to what is obviously a devastating time for North and South America. And, in this case, again, because of the nature of historical records, it's really impossible to know exactly how many people there were, but we can only guesstimate based on the best information that's available. And those estimates are based on what is the best information available.
1347. There's a reason the Black Death shows up on almost every list of the worst times in human history. Apart from the sheer amount of human suffering observed by the people that survived the ordeal, its impact on the future was immense. In many ways, the pandemic shaped up the modern world as we know it. Caused by the bubonic plague, which had already killed millions and thrown entire parts of Europe into chaos back in the 6th century in the form of the Justinian plague, the Black Death showed up in Europe in 1348. While its introduction to the continent is still a matter of debate, some research suggests that it came from intentional biological warfare waged by the Mongols during the siege of Kaffa in 1346, resulting in the beginning of the plague in 1347. While we may never know that for sure, what we do know is the absolutely devastating impact that the disease had on the European population. By some estimates, it killed over 50 million people, which was about 60% of the entire continent's population at the time. That doesn't mean that it was restricted to Europe, as there have been sporadic reports of the disease decimating entire villages and towns in eastern regions like Persia and China too. Thanks to the Mongol wars of conquest in full swing across almost the entire region of Asia and the Middle East at the time, though, records from that era are scarce and mostly unreliable. While the peak of the outbreak lasted for about 6 years, the outbreak wasn't fully over for many more centuries to come, with isolated yet horrifying cases of resurgence reported across Europe till as late as the 17th century. The plague had a far-reaching impact on the politics and social order of the continent, some of which may even be called positive in hindsight. Though for those that witnessed it firsthand, it truly was one of, if not the, worst times to be alive in human history.
Yeah, I think there's an argument to be made that that year should be included. And certainly, as I said earlier, the 14th century in general is definitely got to be in the running for one of the worst centuries in human history. I think the 6th century is another one for sure. Again, this is all subjective. This is all going to depend on exactly how you look at it, what part of history you're going to focus on more. All of those things. But for the most part, I get why they included the years they did. I disagree about 2020. I'm not sure that I would have included that. Some of the other ones are kind of a little bit iffy as well, but decent list. So just a couple of others that I think probably need to be considered. The year 1206, when the Mongol invasions begin. Granted, that took decades or even centuries to unfold, but using the criteria that was used in this video, that's kind of the same thing. 1850, when the Taiping Rebellion begins, which may have killed 30 million people. The transition from one dynasty to another in the 17th century in China. 1937, when you have the Sino-Japanese War beginning. So those are just a few other things that you could argue should be in there as well. So let me know your thoughts. What would you include in the list? Use the comment section below to let me know that. And I want to give a shout out, thank you to Landon in St. Peters, Missouri, and David in Sierra Vista, Arizona. Thank you both so much for your support on Patreon. If you'd like to consider becoming a supporter through Patreon, the link is in the description. Check out some of these other top 10 videos that I'll throw up on the screen for you. Thanks for watching.